Have you ever wondered why you keep repeating the same patterns, even when you know they're not serving you? Why does that toxic relationship dynamic keep showing up with different people? Why do you sabotage yourself right when things start going well? Carl Jung, the revolutionary psychologist who mapped the human psyche like no one before him, discovered that we all fall into invisible psychological traps that keep us stuck in loops of suffering. Today, we're exploring 10 of these traps that might be running your life without you even knowing it. Jung spent decades studying the human mind, and what he found was both disturbing and liberating. Most of what drives our behavior happens in the unconscious. We think we're making free choices, but often we're just playing out ancient patterns, following scripts written long before we could even speak. The good news? Once you understand these traps, you begin to see them everywhere. In yourself, in others, in the very structure of society. And seeing them is the first step toward something Jung called individuation, becoming who you truly are. Trap number 1. The shadow possession. Let's start with Jung's most famous discovery, the shadow. Everything you hate about other people, that's your shadow talking. The shadow contains all the parts of yourself you've rejected, denied, or buried. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The more intensely you react to someone else's behavior, the more likely it is that you're seeing your own disowned qualities. Think about that person who drives you absolutely crazy. Maybe it's their arrogance, their neediness, their selfishness. That intense emotional charge you feel, that's not really about them. That's your shadow recognizing itself in another person and desperately trying to maintain the illusion that, I'm not like that. Jung discovered this through his own life. He noticed that the colleagues who irritated him most were showing him parts of himself he didn't want to acknowledge. The ambitious colleague reminded him of his own hidden desire for recognition. The overly emotional patient reflected his own suppressed feelings. Once he saw this pattern, he realized it was universal. The shadow forms in childhood. Maybe you expressed anger once and were severely punished, so you learned angry people are bad, and pushed all your anger into the shadow. Now, decades later, you're attracted to angry partners who express the rage you can't. Or you find yourself exploding in inappropriate situations because the shadow can't be contained forever. It always finds a way out. Here's what makes the shadow trap so insidious. We spend enormous energy keeping it hidden. Think about how exhausting it is to maintain an image of being nice when you're actually furious, or pretending you don't care about success when ambition burns inside you. All that energy spent on suppression could be used for creativity, relationships, actual living. But instead, we're locked in an internal civil war, fighting parts of ourselves. The shadow isn't just personal, it's collective too. Every culture has a collective shadow containing everything that culture rejects. In cultures that value rationality, emotion becomes shadow. In cultures that prize humility, pride becomes shadow. We project these collective shadows onto other nations, races, religions, those people who embody everything we refuse to see in ourselves. Wars have been fought over shadow projections. Genocides have been justified by them. Chapter 2. The persona identification. Your persona is the mask you wear in public, the role you play in society. We all need personas. You can't walk into a business meeting or a first date as a raw, unfiltered human being. The trap springs when you forget it's just a mask and start believing you are the persona. Jung saw this constantly in his practice. The successful businessman who couldn't access any emotion because it didn't fit his strong leader. Persona. The perfect mother who was dying inside because she couldn't admit she sometimes resented her children. The class clown who was desperately depressed but couldn't drop the funny guy act. These people had become prisoners in masks of their own making. The persona forms through social rewards and punishments. You learn early what gets approval and what gets rejection. Maybe being smart got you love, so you built a persona around intelligence. Now you're terrified of appearing stupid, so you avoid anything you're not immediately good at. Or maybe being beautiful was your currency, so you constructed a persona around appearance. Now aging feels like death because your entire identity is built on something that must inevitably fade. Social media has turned the persona trap into a full-blown crisis. We're not just maintaining one mask anymore. We're curating multiple versions across different platforms. The LinkedIn you, the Instagram you, the dating app you. We spend hours perfecting these images, getting the angle right, choosing the filter, crafting the caption, and then we wonder why we feel so empty, so disconnected from ourselves and others. Jung observed that the thicker the persona, the more underdeveloped the person underneath. It's like a tree that puts all its energy into growing beautiful leaves but has no roots. Impressive from the outside, but the first strong wind will knock it over. People with overdeveloped personas often have midlife crises when the mask no longer fits or when life circumstances force them to drop it. The executive gets fired and doesn't know who he is without his title. The beauty queen ages and faces an identity void. Trap number 3. The projection mechanism. Projection is perhaps the most universal trap and definitely the hardest to see when you're in it. When you project, you see your own unconscious material in the external world. It's like walking around with colored glasses and insisting the world really is that color. Jung discovered projection through his work with transference in therapy. Patients would see him as their father, their savior, their judge, not based on who he was, but on what they were projecting onto him. Then he noticed he was doing the same thing with his patients, seeing his own unconscious material reflected in them. This led to his revolutionary insight. We're all walking around in a hall of mirrors, seeing ourselves everywhere, but thinking we're seeing others. Here's a typical projection pattern. Sarah keeps dating emotionally unavailable men. She's convinced the universe keeps sending her these cold, distant partners. What Sarah doesn't see is that she's terrified of intimacy herself. She unconsciously chooses men who won't challenge her to open up. Their distance allows her to maintain her own walls while blaming them for the relationship's failure. Or take political projections. The conservative projects their disowned chaos onto liberals, seeing them as dangerous radicals destroying order. The liberal projects their disowned authoritarianism onto conservatives, seeing them as fascists crushing freedom. Neither side can see that they're fighting their own shadows. The intensity of the conflict comes not from actual differences, but from the psychological need to keep the projection alive. Jung noticed that projection happens most strongly in intimate relationships. We project our anima or animus, more on this later, onto partners, seeing them not as they are but as embodiments of our unconscious opposite. This is why falling in love feels so magical. You're reuniting with lost parts of yourself, and why relationships often become disappointing. The real person can never live up to the projection. Trap number 4, the parental complex. Long after you leave home, your parents continue living in your head as what Jung called complexes, autonomous partial personalities that can hijack your psyche. The parental complex trap means you're still psychologically controlled by internalized parent figures, making decisions based on their approval or rejection, even if they're long dead. Jung developed this idea from observing how his patients would suddenly transform when certain topics arose. A confident adult would become a cowering child when discussing authority. A successful professional would turn into a rebellious teenager when facing rules. These weren't conscious choices. Something else was taking over, speaking through them, making their decisions. The mother complex might manifest as an inability to nurture yourself, always seeking mothering from others. Or conversely, compulsively mothering everyone around you, trying to give what you never received. Men with mother complexes might seek mothers rather than partners, looking for women to take care of them. Women might compete with every other woman, seeing them all as rivals for mother's love. The father complex often shows up around authority and achievement. You might be forever trying to impress a father who never approved, working yourself to death for praise that will never come. Or rebelling against all authority, seeing every boss, every rule, every structure as the oppressive father. Jung noted that entire political movements can be driven by collective father complexes, masses of people projecting their unresolved father issues onto government, either seeking a strong paternal figure or rebelling against paternal control. What makes these complexes so powerful is that they're autonomous. When triggered, they temporarily possess you. You're no longer choosing your responses. The complex is running the show. That's why you can know intellectually that your boss isn't your father, but still react to criticism as if you're 7 years old being scolded. Trap number 5. The collective unconscious patterns. Beneath your personal unconscious lies what Jung called the collective unconscious, inherited psychological patterns shared by all humanity. These archetypal patterns can trap you in roles that have been played out millions of times throughout history, turning you into a walking cliché rather than an individual. The hero archetype might possess you, making you see every situation as a battle to win. You exhaust yourself fighting dragons that exist mainly in your imagination, turning colleagues into enemies, conversations into competitions, life into an endless war. The hero can't rest, can't receive help, can't show vulnerability, because heroes don't do that. The martyr archetype creates a different trap, finding meaning only through suffering. People possessed by this pattern unconsciously create situations where they can suffer nobly. They stay in terrible relationships, not because they have to, but because suffering feels meaningful. They confuse pain with purpose, sacrifice with love. Jung observed that martyrs often had parents who only showed care when the child was sick or struggling, programming them to equate suffering with love. The eternal child archetype keeps people in perpetual psychological adolescence. They refuse responsibilities, avoid commitment, always looking for someone to take care of them. They might be 50 years old, but still waiting for life to really begin, still expecting someone else to make the important decisions. Jung noted this archetype has become more common in modern society, where extended adolescence is increasingly possible and even encouraged. The mother archetype can possess both men and women, creating compulsive caretakers who only exist through nurturing others. They have no identity outside of being needed. When their children grow up or their caring role ends, they face an existential crisis. Who are they when no one needs them? Trap. 6. The Animus possession. Jung's concept of the anima, the unconscious feminine in men, and animus, the unconscious masculine in women, reveals one of the deepest traps in human psychology. When these remain unconscious, they possess us, creating our most destructive relationship patterns and internal conflicts. A man possessed by his anima experiences wild mood swings that seem to come from nowhere. One moment he's logical and clear, the next he's drowning in emotions he can't name. He might fall obsessively in love with women who embody his projected anima, mysterious, ethereal creatures who seem to hold the key to his soul. But these relationships always disappoint because he's not relating to a real woman, but to his own unconscious feminine nature. Jung observed that men's anima often carries their capacity for relationship, emotion, and creativity. When undeveloped, it manifests as moodiness, vanity, and seduction. A man might become catty and gossipy when threatened, displaying a primitive femininity he would never consciously own. Or he might be completely cut off from his feelings, projecting all emotional life onto women, expecting them to feel for him. Women possessed by their animus might find themselves spouting opinions that sound authoritative, but feel disconnected from their actual experience. They become rigidly argumentative, needing to be right at all costs. Jung noticed that women's animus often carries their capacity for logic, discrimination, and spiritual meaning. When unconscious, it manifests as brutal criticism, both of self and others. The animus possession can make a woman unnecessarily harsh, speaking in absolutes. You always, how you never. All men are. These pronouncements come not from her conscious mind, but from the possessed state. She might be drawn to men who embody her projected animus, perhaps cold intellectuals or dominating authority figures who seem to possess the power she doesn't claim for herself. Jung saw that modern culture makes this trap worse by discouraging the development of contrasexual qualities. Men are taught to reject anything feminine, so their anima remains primitive. Women might be discouraged from developing masculine qualities, so their animus stays undeveloped. These rejected aspects then emerge in distorted, sometimes destructive ways. Trap. 7. The inflation identification. Inflation happens when you identify with something greater than your personal ego, an archetype, a cause, a role, and lose your human limitations. You become possessed by something transpersonal, thinking you are the wise teacher, the perfect mother, the enlightened one. Jung considered this one of the most dangerous psychological states. You see inflation in spiritual teachers who begin believing they're gurus, above normal human morality. In activists who become so identified with their cause that they lose empathy for actual humans. In artists who think they're channels for divine creativity and therefore above criticism. In parents who believe they're the perfect mother or father, unable to see how they're damaging their children. Jung experienced inflation himself and saw it as an occupational hazard of depth psychology. When you work with the unconscious, you encounter powerful energies that can overwhelm the ego. You might have a profound dream or synchronicity and think you're chosen, special, destined for greatness. This isn't just arrogance, it's possession by something beyond the personal. The inflation trap is especially seductive in our age of personal branding and social media influence. People become identified with their follower count, their expertise, their image. They start believing their own hype, losing touch with their ordinary humanity. They can't admit mistakes, can't show vulnerability, can't learn anything new, because that would threaten the inflated identity. Jung observed that inflation always leads to a fall. The psyche has self-regulating mechanisms that eventually burst the inflation bubble. The guru has a scandal. The perfect parent's child rebels dramatically. The infallible expert makes a public mistake. These falls are painful but necessary, bringing the person back to human dimensions. Trap number 8. The synchronicity addiction. Jung coined the term synchronicity for meaningful coincidences, events connected not by causation but by meaning. This was one of his most controversial ideas, and the trap around it is equally complex. People can become so obsessed with finding meaning in coincidences that they lose touch with ordinary reality. Someone caught in this trap sees signs everywhere. Every license plate contains a message. Every overheard conversation is meant for them. Every coincidence is the universe speaking directly to them. They spend so much energy interpreting these supposed messages that they neglect practical life. They're so busy reading cosmic significance into random events that they miss actual opportunities. Jung himself was careful to distinguish genuine synchronicity from projection and wishful thinking. True synchronicities, he said, occur during significant psychological transitions and carry a numinous quality. They feel meaningful in a way that transcends rational explanation, but the trap turns every coincidence into a cosmic telegram. This trap often catches people during psychological crisis or spiritual awakening. When ordinary meaning structures break down, the psyche desperately seeks new patterns. Suddenly everything seems connected, everything has hidden significance. While this can be part of genuine psychological transformation, it can also become a defense against dealing with practical reality. Jung noted that synchronicity addiction can be a form of inflation. Believing the universe is personally communicating with you makes you special, chosen, important. It can also be a way to avoid responsibility. Instead of making difficult decisions, you wait for signs. Instead of taking action, you interpret symbols. Trap number 9. The complex constellation. Complexes are like independent personalities living within your psyche. When a complex gets triggered, or constellated in Jung's terms, it temporarily takes over, and you're no longer in charge of your consciousness. Everyone has complexes. The question is whether you have them or they have you. When possessed by a complex, you lose freedom of response. Someone mentions your appearance, and the inferiority complex takes over. Suddenly, you're that bullied child again, feeling ugly and worthless. Your partner is 5 minutes late, and the abandonment complex activates. You're convinced they're leaving you, just like everyone always does. An authority figure gives feedback, and the father complex erupts. You're either rebelling like a teenager or complying like a frightened child. Jung discovered complexes through his word association tests. He would say a word and measure how long it took someone to respond. Certain words caused delays, strange responses, emotional reactions. These pointed to complexes. He realized these weren't just interesting psychological phenomena, but the core of neurosis. People weren't suffering from abstract conditions, but from activated complexes that hijacked their psyche. Complexes form around emotional wounds. usually from childhood. Every time you were shamed for showing excitement, a complex formed around spontaneity. Every time you were punished for making mistakes, a complex formed around perfectionism. These complexes then lie dormant until triggered, at which point they possess you with all the emotional intensity of the original wound. What makes complexes so insidious is that they feel completely justified when activated. The emotions are real, the thoughts seem logical, the reactions feel appropriate. You don't realize you're not responding to the present, but reliving the past. That's why the same fights happen in relationships over and over. It's not about the dishes or the text message, it's about the complexes being triggered. Trap number 10, the transcendent function failure. The transcendent function is the psyche's ability to unite opposites and create something new from the tension. When this function fails, you're trapped in either-or thinking, unable to hold paradox or find creative solutions. You're stuck in a psychological splitting that prevents growth. People caught in this trap see everything in binary terms. You're either successful or a failure. Relationships are either perfect or doomed. You must choose between security and freedom, creativity and stability, independence and connection. This black and white thinking creates impossible choices and constant inner conflict. Jung discovered the transcendent function through observing how psychological growth actually happens. It's not through choosing one side over another, but through holding the tension until a third option emerges, something that includes both opposites but transcends them. This is how consciousness evolves, how we become more than we were. Without the transcendent function, you swing between extremes. One month you're completely devoted to work, the next you're ready to quit everything. You're either merged with a partner or completely distant. You're all in or all out, with no middle ground, no integration, no synthesis. Jung saw this as the fundamental mechanism of neurosis, the inability to hold tension and let it transform into something new. Instead of creative solutions, people get repetitive symptoms. Instead of growth, they get stuck patterns. The same conflicts play out endlessly because the transcendent function that could resolve them isn't operating. The deeper implications. What Jung understood, perhaps more than any psychologist before or since, is that these traps are not personal failures. They are built into the structure of the psyche itself. We all have shadows, personas, complexes, projections. We all get inflated, possessed, caught in archetypal patterns. This isn't because we're weak or flawed, but because we're human. Jung also saw that these traps serve a purpose in psychological development. The shadow contains not just our darkness, but our unlived potential. Projection shows us what we need to integrate. Complexes point to where we need healing. Even inflation and possession can be part of the individuation process. Sometimes we need to be taken over by something greater to break out of too narrow ego boundaries. The real tragedy isn't that we fall into these traps. It's that most people never become conscious of them. They live their entire lives possessed by complexes, projecting their shadows identified with their personas, never knowing that another way is possible. They suffer, but they don't know why. They repeat patterns but can't see them. They're stuck, but don't know what's holding them. Jung believed that consciousness itself was evolving through human beings, becoming aware of these patterns. Every person who recognizes their projections integrates their shadow, or breaks free from a complex advances not just their own development, but the development of the collective human psyche. We're all participating in something larger than ourselves, the gradual awakening of consciousness itself. This is why Jung spent his life mapping these traps, not to judge or pathologize, but to make conscious what was unconscious. He knew that simple awareness changes everything. The moment you see you're projecting, the projection begins to dissolve. The instant you recognize a complex, you start to have choice. The second you notice you're identified with your persona, you begin to remember who you really are. These psychological traps have shaped human history. Wars have been fought over shadow projections. Societies have been structured around collective complexes. Entire civilizations have fallen into archetypal patterns, playing out the same dynamics over and over. But Jung believed we're at a turning point where these patterns can become conscious on a collective level. The same psychological work that frees individuals can free cultures. Understanding these traps also reveals why genuine psychological change is so difficult. It's not enough to understand them intellectually. They must be experienced, suffered through, integrated. You can read about the shadow for years without integrating a single dark aspect. You can know all about projection while still blaming others for your problems. Real transformation happens not through knowledge, but through the difficult work of seeing these patterns in yourself, catching them in action, choosing differently, even when every fiber of your being wants to fall into the familiar trap. Jung's vision was radical. He saw human beings not as fixed entities, but as ongoing processes of becoming. These traps aren't permanent prisons, but temporary stages in development. Every trap contains its own solution. Every complex points toward its own resolution. Every shadow holds the key to wholeness. The very things that keep us stuck also contain the energy for transformation, if we can become conscious enough to see them. If these ideas stirred something deep within you, if you felt the pull toward a more authentic existence, you're not alone in this journey. Subscribe to School of Philosophy and ring the notification bell to join thousands of free thinkers exploring the deepest questions of human existence. Your awakening mind deserves nothing less.